The Wish House. Late came the god, having sent his forerunners who were not regarded, late but in wrath, saying, the wrong shall be paid, the contempt be rewarded on all that she hath. He poisoned the blade, and struck home, the full bosom receiving, the wound and the venom in one, past cure or relieving. He made treaty with time, to stand still, that the grief might be fresh, daily renewed and nightly pursued, through her soul to her flesh. Mornings of memory, noontides of agony, midnights unslacked for her, till the stones of the streets of her hells and her paradise ached for her. So she lived while her body corrupted upon her, and she called on the night for a sign, and a sign was allowed, and she builded an altar and served by the light of her vision, alone, without hope of regard or reward, but uncowed, resolute, selfless, divine. These things she did in love's honor. What is a god beside woman? Dust and derision. The Wish House. The new church visitor had just left after a 20 minutes call. During that time, Mrs. Ashcroft had used such English as an elderly, experienced, and pensioned cook should, who had seen life in London. She was a readier, therefore, to slip back into easy, ancient Sussex, T's softening to D's as one warmed. When the bus brought Miss Fetley from 30 miles away for a visit, that pleasant March Saturday, the two had been friends since childhood, but as of late, destiny had separated their meetings by long intervals. Much was to be said, and many ends loose since last time to be ravelled up on both sides, before Mrs. Fetley, with her bag of quilt patches, took the couch beneath the window commanding the garden, and the football ground in the valley below. "Most folk got out at bush tire for the match there," she explained, "so there aren't no one for me to cushion again. The last 5 miles, and she do just bounce you." "You've took no hurt," said her hostess. "You don't brittle by aging, Liz." Mrs. Fetley chuckled and made to match a couple of patches to her liking. "No, and I'd a broke 20 year back. You can't ever mind when I was so's to be called round, can you?" Mrs. Ashcroft shook her head slowly. She never hurried, and went on stitching a sackcloth lining into a list-bound rush tool basket. Mrs. Fetley laid out more patches in the spring light through the geraniums on the window-sill, and they were silent a while. "And what's like this new visitor of yourn?" Miss Fetley inquired with a nod toward the door. Being very short-sighted, she had, on her entrance, almost bumped into the lady. Mrs. Ashcroft suspended the big packing-needle judiciously on high, ere she stabbed home. "Settin' aside she don't bring much news with her yet, I don't know as I've anything special agin her." "Our'n at Keenslade," said Miss Fetley. "She's full o' worrin' and a pity, but she don't stay for her answers. You can get on with your thoughts while she clacks." "This un don't clack. She's aimin' to be one of those high church nuns like. Ourn's married, but, by the way they say, she made no great gains of it." Mrs. Fetley threw up her sharp chin. "Lord, how they damn cherubim do shake the very bones of the place." The tile-sided cottage trembled at the passage of 2 specially chartered 40-seat charabancs on their way to the bush tie match. A regular Saturday shopping bus, for the country's capital, fumed behind them, while from one of the crowded inns a 4th car backed out to join the procession, and held up the stream of through-pleasure traffic. "You're as free-tongued as ever, Liz," Mrs. Ashcroft observed. "Only when I'm with you. Otherwise I'm granny, 3 times over. I lay that basket's for one of your grandchilder, ain't it?" "'Tis for Arthur, my Jane's eldest. But he ain't working nowheres, is he?" "No, 'tis a picnic basket." "You're let off light. My Willie, he's always at me for money for them air-treated wash-poles folk up in their gardens to draw the music from London, and I give it to 'em. Poor fool me. And he forgets to give you the promise kiss after, don't he?" Mrs. Ashcroft's heavy smile seemed to strike inwards. "He do. No odds 'twixt boys and 40 years back, and give 'em naught and we take all and give naught, and we have to put up with it. Poor fool we, 3 shillin' at a time and Willie'll ask me for." "They don't make nothing of money these days," Mrs. Ashcroft said. "And only last week," the other went on, "me daughter, she ordered a quarter-pound suet at the butcher's, and she sent it back to 'em to be chopped. She said she couldn't bother with chopping it. I lay he charged her then. I lay he did. She told me there was a whisk drive that afternoon at the Institute, and she couldn't bother to do with the chopping. Tick. Mrs. Ashcroft put the last firm touches to the basket lining. She had scarcely finished when her 16-year-old grandson, a maiden of the moment in attendance, hurried up the garden path, shouting to know if the thing were ready, snatched it, and made off without acknowledgment. Mrs. Fetley peered at him closely. "They're going picnicking somewheres," Mrs. Ashcroft explained. "Ah," says the other with narrowed eyes. "I lay he won't show much mercy to any he comes across either. Now who does he remind me of all of a sudden?" "They must look after theirselves, same as we did." Mrs. Ashcroft began to set out the tea. "No denying you could, Gracie," says Mrs. Featherly. "What's in your head now?" "I don't know, but it come over me sudden like about that woman from Rye. I've slipped the name. Barsley, wasn't it? Batten, Polly Batten you're thinking of." "That's it, Polly Batten. That day she had it in you with the hay fork. Time we was all haying at Smaldene for stealing a man. But you heard me tell her that she had my leave to keep him." Mrs. Ashcroft's voice and smile were smoother than ever. "I did, and when we was all looking, that she'd prod the fork sprang through your breastus when you said it. No, she'd never go beyond bounds, Polly. She struck too much for real's doing." "Allays seems to me," Mrs. Featherly said after a pause, "that a man twixt two fighting women is the foolishest thing on earth, like a dog being called two ways." "Maybe. But what sets you off in those times, Liz?" "That boy's fashion of carrying his head in arms. I haven't rightly looked at him since he's growed. Your Jane never showed it, but him, why 'tis Jim Batten and his tricks come to life again, eh? Maybe. There's some that would have made it out so, being barren like themselves. Uh-oh. Ah, well, dearie me now, and Jim Batten's been dead this 27 years, Mrs. Ashcroft answered briefly. "Won't you draw up, Liz?" Mrs. Featherly drew up to buttered toast, currant bread, stewed tea, bitter as leather, some home-preserved pears, and a cold boiled pig's tail to help down the muffins. She paid all with the proper compliments. "Yes, I don't know as I've ever owed me belly much," said Mrs. Ashcroft thoughtfully. "We only go through this world once." "But don't it lay you heavy on you sometimes?" her guest suggested. "Nurse says I'm a sight liker to die of me indigestion than me leg," for Mrs. Ashcroft had a long-standing ulcer on her shin which needed regular care from the village nurse, who boasted, or others did for her, that she dressed it 103 times already during her term of office. "And you was so able, too. It's all come on you before your time, like. I've watched you goin'," Mrs. Fetley spoke with real affection. "Something's bound to find you sometimes, and me heart left me still," Mrs. Ashcroft returned. "You was always big-hearted enough for 3. That's something to look back on at the day's end." "I reckon you've your back-lookings, too," was Mrs. Ashcroft's answer. "You know it, but I don't think much regarding such matters except when I'm along with you, Gra. Takes 2 sticks to make a fire." Mrs. Fetley stared, with jaw half dropped, at the grocer's bright calendar on the wall. The cottage shook again to the roar of the motor traffic, and the crowded football ground below the garden roared almost as loudly, for the village was well set to its Saturday leisure. Mrs. Fetley had spoken very precisely for some time without interruption, before she wiped her eyes. "And," she concluded, "they read his death notice to me out of the paper last month. Of course it wasn't any of my becoming concerns, let being I hadn't set eyes on him for so long. Of course I couldn't say nor show nothing, nor I'd no rightful call to go Eastbourne to see his grave, either. I've been scheming to slip over there by bus some day, but they'd ask questions of own past endurance, so I haven't even that to stay me. But you've had your satisfactions." "God, yes! For those 4 years he was a-working on the rail near us, and the other drivers gave him a brave funeral, too. Then you've naught to cast up about. Not the cup of tea?" The light and air had changed a little with the sun's descent, and the 2 elderly ladies closed the kitchen door against chill. A couple of jays squealed and skirmished through the undraped apple trees in the garden. This time the word was with Miss Ashcroft, her elbows on the tea-table and her sick leg propped on a stool. "Well, I never! But what did your husband say to that?" Mrs. Fetley asked, when the deep-toned recital halted. "He said I might go where I pleased for all of him, but seeing I was bedrid, I said I'd tend him out. He knowed I wouldn't take no advantage of him in that estate. He lasted 8 or 9 weeks. Then he was took with a seizure like, and laid stone still for days. Then he popped himself a bed and says, 'You'll pray no man ever deal with you like you deal with some. And you,' I says, 'you know, Liz, what a rover he was. It cuts both ways,' says he, 'but I'm deathwise, and I can see what's coming to you. He died a Sunday, and was buried a Thursday, and yet I'd set a heap by him one time. Did I ever?" "You never told me that before," Mrs. Fetley ventured. "I'm paying you for what you told me just now. Him being dead, I wrote up saying I was free for good to that Miss Marshall in London, which gave me my first place as kitchen maid. Lord, how long ago! She was well pleased, for they two was both in getting on, and I knowed their ways. You remember, Liz, I used to go to 'em in service between whiles, for years, when we wanted money, and when my husband was away on occasion." "He did get that 6 months in Chichester, didn't he?" Mrs. Fetley whispered. "We never rightly won to the bottom of it. He'd a got more, but the man didn't die. None of your doings, was it, Gra?" "No, 'twas the woman's husband at the time. And so, my man being dead, I went back to the Marshalls as cook to get me legs under a gentleman's table again, and be called with a handle to me name. That was the year that you shifted to Portsmouth." "Caution," Mrs. Fetley corrected. "There was a middling lot of new building being done there. My man went first and got the room, and I followed. Well then, I was about a year bouts in London, and all out of breath like, 4 meals a day and easy living. Then long towards autumn, they two went travelling like, to France, keeping me on, for they couldn't do without me. I put the house to rights for the caretaker, and then I slipped down to me sister Bessie's, me wages in me pockets, and all hands glad to be hold of me." "That would be when I was at Cosham," said Miss Fetley. "You know, Liz, there wasn't no cheap dog pride to folk those days, no more than there was cinemas or whisk drives. Man or woman would lay hold of any job that promised a shilling to the backside of it, didn't they? I was all peaked up after London, and I thought the fresh airs had served me. So I took on at Smaldene, obliging with a hand at the elderly potato lifting, stubbing ends and such like. They'd have mocked me sore in my kitchen in London to see me in men's boots and my petticoats all shorted." "Did it bring you good?" Miss Fetley asked. "'Twasn't for that I went, you know. Swells me that none happens till it's happened. Your mind don't warn you beforehand of the road you took, till you're at the far end of it. We've only a backward view of our proceedings." "Or was it?" "Harry Mockler." Mrs. Ashcroft's face puckered to the pain of her sick leg. Mrs. Fetley gasped. "Harry? Bert Mockler's son? And I never guessed." Mrs. Ashcroft nodded. "And I told myself and believed it, that I wanted field work." "What did you get out of it?" "The usuals. Everything at first, worse than not after. I had signs and warnings aplenty, but I took no heed of 'em, for we was burning rubbish one day, just when we'd come to know how it was with both of us. 'Twas early in the year for burning, and I said so. 'No,' says he. 'The sooner that old stuff is done with,' he says, 'the better.' His face was hard on the rocks when he spoke. Then it came over me that I found me master, which I hadn't done before. I'd allus owned him like. Then it come over me that I found me master, which I hadn't ever before. I'd allus owned him like." The other sighed. "Yes, yes, they're in yourn and yourn then," the other sighed. "I like the right way best." "I didn't, but Harry did. Long then it come for me to go back to London. I clean couldn't. So I took and tipped a dollop of scalding water out of the copper one morning, over me left hand and shoulder. That stayed me where I was for another fortnight." "Was it worth it?" said Miss Fetley, looking at the silvery scar on the wrinkled forearm. Mrs. Ashcroft nodded. "And for that we made it up twixt us, so he could come to London for a job and livery stable not far from me. He got it. I tended to that. There wasn't no talk nowhere. His very own mother never suspicioned how it 'twas. He just slipped up to London, and there we abode that winter, not half a mile t'other from each. You paid his fare and all, though." Miss Fetley spoke convincedly. Again Mrs. Ashcroft nodded. "There wasn't much that I didn't do for him. He was me master, and, oh, God help us, we laughed it over all walking together in the dark in them paved streets, and me corn's fair wenching in me boots. I'd never been like that before, near he. Mrs. Fetley chuckled sympathetically. "And when did he come to an end?" "And when did he come to the end?" she asked. "When he paid it all back again, every penny. Then I knowed, but I wouldn't suffer myself to know. 'You've been mortal kind to me,' he says. 'Kind,' I says, 'twixt us.' But he kept on telling me how kind I'd been, and I'd never forget it all his days. I held it off of me for 3 evenings, because I would not believe. Then he talked about not being satisfied with his job in the stables, and the men there were putting on tricks on him, and all the lies which a man tells when he's leaving him. I heard him out, neither helping nor hindering. At the last, I took off a little brooch which he gave me, and I says, 'That'll do, and I ain't asking none.' And I turned me round and walked off to me own sufferings. He didn't make 'em worse,
He didn't come nor right after that. He slipped off here, back home to his mother again." "Oh, and how often did you look for him to come back?" Mrs. Fetley demanded mercilessly. "More'n once. Going over the streets we used, I thought the very pavestones had struck out under me feet." "Yes," says Miss Fetley. "I know, but that don't hurt us as much as aught else. And that was all you got?" "No, 'twasn't. That's the curious part, if you'll believe it, Liz." "I do. I lay you further off line now than all your life, Graw. I am. And I suffered like I'd not wish my most erringest enemies to. God's own name, I went through that hoop that spring. One part of it was headaches, and I'd never known all me days. Think of me with an headache! But I come to be grateful for 'em. They keep me from thinking." "'Tis like a tooth," Miss Fetterly commented. "It must rage and rug till it tortures itself quiet on you, and then there's none left. I got enough left to last me all my days on earth. It come about through our charwoman's little girl. Sophie Ellis was her name. All eyes and elbows and hunger. I used to give her our victuals. Otherwise I took no special notice of her, and a sight less, of course, when me trouble about Harry was on me. But you know how little maids feel at first sometimes. She come to be crazy fond of me, pawning all cuddling all whiles, and I hadn't the heart to beat her off. One afternoon, early in spring 'twas, her mother had sent her round to scritchel up what little victuals she could get off of us. I was setting by the fire, me apron over me head, half mad with the headache, when she slips in. I reckon I was middlin' short with her. 'Lord,' she says, 'is that all? I'll take it off you in 2 I told her not to lay a finger on me, for I thought she wants to stroke my forehead, and I ain't that make. 'I won't touch you,' she says, and slips out again. She hadn't been gone 10 minutes, for me old headache took off as quick as it's been kicked. So I went about my work brazenly. Sophie comes back and creeps into my chair quiet as a mouse. Her eyes were deep in her head and her face all drawed. I asked what had happened. 'Nothing,' she says, 'only I've got it now.' 'Got what?' I says. 'Your headache,' she says, all hoarse and sickly-lipped. 'It took it on me.' 'Nonsense,' I says. 'It went off of itself when you was out. Lay still and I'll make you a cup of tea.' 'Twon't do no good,' she says, 'till your time's up. How long do your headaches last?' 'Don't look silly,' I says, 'or I'll send for the doctor.' It looked to me as if she might be hatching the measles. 'Oh, Mrs. Ashcroft,' she says, stretching out her little thin arms, 'I do love you.' There hadn't been any holding agin that. I took her into me lap and made much of her. 'Is it truly gone?' she says. 'Yes,' I says, 'and if it 'twas you who took it away, I'm truly grateful. 'Twas me,' she says, laying her cheek to mine. 'No one but me knows how.' And then she said she changed me headache for me at a wish-house." "What?" Miss Fetley spoke sharply. "A wish-house! No, I hadn't heard of such things either. I couldn't get it straight at first, but putting all together, I made out that a wish-house had to be a house which had stood unlet and empty long enough for some one like to come and inhabit there. She said a little girl she played with in the livery stables where Harry worked had told her so. She said the girl had belonged in a caravan and laid up her winters in London. Gypsy, I judge." "Ah, there's no saying what gippos know, but I never heard of a wish-house, and I know some things," said Mrs. Fetley. "Sophie said there was a wish-house in Waterloo's Road, just a few streets off, on the way to our greengrocer's. All you had to do, she said, was to ring the bell and wish your wish through the slit of the letter-box. I asked her if the fairies give it to her. 'Don't you know,' she says, 'there's no fairies in a wish-house, there's only a token.'" "Good Lord Almighty, where did she come by that word?" cried Miss Fetley. "For a token is a wrath of the dead, or worse still, of the living. The caravan girl had told her, she said. Well, Liz, it troubled me to hear her, and lying in me arms she must have felt it. 'That's very kind of you,' I says, holding her tight, 'to wish me headache away. Why didn't you ask for something nice for yourself?' 'You can't do that,' she says. 'All you'll get is a wish-house is leave to take someone else's troubles. I've took Ma's headaches when she's been kind to me, but this is the first time I've been able to do aught for you. Oh, Miss Ashcroft, I do just about love you,' and she goes on all like that. Liz, I tell you my hair almost stood up on end to end, and I asked her what the token was. 'I'll know,' she says, 'but after you've ring the bell, you'll hear it run up from the basement to the front door. Then say your wish,' she says, 'and go away. The token don't open the door, do you, then?' I says, 'Oh, no,' she says, 'you only hear giggling like behind the front door. Then you say you'll take the trouble off of whoever it is that you chose for your love, and you'll get as she says. I didn't ask no more. When she was too hot and fevered, I made much of her until it came time to light the gas, and a little after that, her headache, mine I suppose, took off, and she got down and played with the cat. Well, I never, said Miss Fettley. Did you follow it up anyways? She asked me to, but I wouldn't have no such dealings with a child. What did you do then? Sat in my own room, stood at the kitchen, and with my headaches come on, but it lay at the back of my mind. 'Twould. Did she tell you more ever? No. Besides what the Gippo girl had told her, she knew naught except the charm worked. And next after that, in May 'twas, I suffered the summer out in London. 'Twas an hot and windy for weeks, and the streets stinking of those dried horse dung blowing from side to side, and lying level with the curb. 'Twas hot and windy for weeks, and the streets stinking of dried horse dung blowing from side to side, and lying level with the curb. We don't get that nowadays. And I had my old lady just before hopping and coming down here to say with Bessie again. She noticed I'd lost flesh and was all poochy under the eyes. Did you see Harry? Mrs. Ashcroft nodded. The 4th. No, the 5th day. Wednesday 'twas. I knowed he was working at Smaldene again. I asked his mother in the streets, bold as brass. She hadn't much room to say much, for Bessie, you know, her tongue was a talking full clack. But that Wednesday I was walking with one of Bessie's children hanging out my skirts, and at the back of Chanter's Tot. Presently I felt he was behind me on the footpath, and I knowed his stride had changed his nature. I slowed, and I heard him slow. Then I fussed a piece with the child to force him past me like, so he had to come past. And he just says good evening, and goes on trying to pull himself together. Drunk, was he? Miss Fettley asked. Never. Shrunk and wizen, his clothes hanging in him like bags, and the back of his neck is whiter than chalk. 'Twas all I could do to not open my arms and cry after him, but I swallowed my spittle till I was back home again and the children in bed. Then I says to Bessie after supper, what in the world's coming to Harry Muckler? Bessie told me he'd been at a hospital for 2 months, long a cutting his foot away with a spade, mucking out in a old pond in Smaldene. There was a poison in the dirt, and it rushed up his leg, and it'll come out all over him. He hadn't been back to his job catering at Smaldene more than a fortnight. She told me that the doctor said he'd likely go off with the November frosties, and his mother had told him that he don't rightly eat nor sleep, and sweated himself into pools. No odds how chill he lay, and he spit terrible o' mornings. Dearie me, I says, but maybe open, it'll set him all right again. And I licked me thread point, and I fetched me needle's eye up to it, and I threads me needle under the lamp, steady as rocks. And that night my bed was under the wash house. I cried and cried. And you know, Liz, for you've been with me in my throes, it takes summat to make me cry. Yes, but childbearing's only just pain, said Miss Fettley. I come round by cockcrow and dabbed cold tea on my eyes to take away the signs. Long towards next evening I was setting out to lay some flowers on my husband's grave for the look of the thing. I met Harry over again where the war memorial is now. He was coming back from his horses, and so he could not see me. I looked him all over, and Harry says, twixt me teeth, come back and rest up in London. I won't take it, he says, for I can give you naught. Harry, I don't ask it, I says. By God's own name, I don't ask none. Only come up when I see a London doctor. He lifts his 2 heavy eyes at me. 'Tis past that, gra, he says. I've but a few months left, Harry, I says. My man, I says. I couldn't say no more. 'Twas up all in my throat. Thank you kindly, gra, he says. But he never says my woman. And he went up the street, and his mother, oh damn her, she was watching for him, and she shut the door behind him. Mrs. Fettley reached an arm across the table, and made to finger Mrs. Ashcroft's sleeve at the wrist, but the other moved it out of reach. So I went on to the churchyards with my flowers, and I remembered my husband's warning that night he spoke. He was death-wise, and it happened as he said. But as I was setting down the jam-pot at the grave mound, it came over me that there was one thing I could do for Harry. Doctor or no doctor, I thought I could make a trial of it. So I did. Next morning, a bill came down from my London greengrocer, Mrs. Marshall. She left me a petty cash for such like, of course, but I told old Bess 'twas for me to come and open the house. So I went up afternoon train. But I know you hadn't you no fear? What for? There was nothing front of me, but my own shame and God's cruelty. I couldn't ever get Harry. How could I? I knowed it must go on burning till it burned me out. Aye, says Miss Fetley, reaching for the wrist again, and this time Mrs. Ashcroft permitted it. It was a comfort to know I could try this for him, and I paid the greengrocer's bill, and put his receipt in me handbag, and then I stepped round to Mrs. Ellis, our chair, and I got the house keys and opened the house. First I made me bed to come back to, God's own nature, me bed to lie upon. Next I made up a cup of tea and sat down in the kitchen thinking, till long towards dusk. Terrible close it was. Then I dressed and went out with the receipt in my bag and feigning to study it for an address like 14 Waldlow's Road was the place, a little basement-like house in a row 20 or 30 such, and tidy strips of walled garden in front. They've painted off the front doors, and nothing done to nothing since ever so long. There wasn't hardly no one in the street except the cats. 'Twas hot, too. I turned into the gate bold as brass, up the steps, when I ringed the front door bell. She pealed loud, like it do in an empty house. When she'd all ceased, I heard a cheer like, pushed back on the floor of the kitchen. Then I heard feet on the stairs, like it might have been a heavy woman in slippers. They come up the stairhead or across the hall. I heard them bare hands creak up under 'em. Then I heard feet on the kitchen stairs, like it might have been a heavy woman in slippers. So they come up to the stairhead across the hall. I heard 'em, the bare boards, creak under 'em, and at the front door they stopped. I stooped me to the letterbox slit, and I says, "Let me take everything bad that's in store for my man, Harry Mockler, for love's sake." Then, whatever it was on the other side of the door, it let its breath out like, as if it'd been holding it to hear better. "Nothing was said to you?" Mrs. Fetley demanded. "Nothing. She just breathed out a sort of like. Then the steps went back and down the stairs to the kitchen all draggy, and I heard the cheer drawed up again." "And you abode on the doorstep throughout it all, Gra?" Mrs. Ashcroft nodded. "Then I went away, and a man passing says to me, 'Didn't you know that house was empty?' 'No,' I says. 'I must have been given the wrong number.' And I went back to our house, and I went to bed, for I was fair flogged out. 'Twas too hot, and to sleep more in snatches, so I walked about me and lying down betweens till crack of dawn. Just then I went to the kitchen to make me a cup of tea, and I hitted myself just above the ankle on an old roasting jack of mine that Mrs. Ellis has moved out of the corner, her last cleaning. And so next, after that, I waited till the marshals come back of their holiday. Alone there, and I'd have thought you had enough of empty houses," said Miss Fetley, horrified. "Oh, Mrs. Ellis and Sophie was running in and out soon's I was back, and twixt us we cleaned the house again top to bottom. There's always a hand to turn more to do in every house, and that's how 'twas with me all that autumn and winter in London." "Then nothing happened overtook you for your doings?" Mrs. Ashcroft smiled. "No, not then. Long in November I sent Bessie 10 shillings. "You was always free-handed," Miss Fetley interrupted, "and I got what I paid for, with the rest of the news. She said the hopping had set him up wonderful. He'd had 6 weeks of it, and now he was back again, catering at Smaldene. No odds to me how it happened, so long's it's had. But I dunno as my 10 shillings eased me much, Harry being dead, like. He'd have been mine till judgment. Harry being alive, he'd like as not pick up with some woman middling quick. I raged over that. Come spring, I had something else to rage for. I growed a nasty little weeping boil like on my shin, just above the boot top, that wouldn't heal no shape. It made me sick to look at, for I'm clean fleshed by nature. Chopped me all over with a spade, and I'd heal like turf. Then Mrs. Marshall sent a doctor at me. He said I ought to have come to him at first go off, instead of drawing all manner of dying stockings over it for months. He said I stood up too much for me work, for it was setting very close atop a big swell vein like, be either the small of me ankle. So, slow come, slow go, he says. Lay your leg up on high and rest it, he says, and twill he's off. Don't let it close up too soon. You've got a very fine leg, Mrs. Ashcroft, he says, and he put me wet dressings on. He done right, Miss Fetley spoke firmly. Wet dressings to wet wounds, they draw the humours, same's a lamp wick draws the oil. That's true, and Mrs. Marshall was always at me to make me set down more, and that night it healed up. And then, after a while, they packed me off to Bessie's to finish the cure, for I ain't the sort to sit down when I ought to stand up. You was back in the village then, Liz. I was, but never did I guess. You didn't deserve you to. Mrs. Ashcroft smiled. I saw Harry once or twice in the street, wonderful fleshed up and restored back. Then one day I didn't see him, and his mother told me one of his horses had lashed out and caught him in the lip. So he was in bed and middling painful. And Bessie, she says to his mother, 'twas a pity Harry didn't have a woman of his own to take the nursing off her. And the old lady was mad. She told us that Harry had never looked after any woman in his born days, and as long as he was atop of the moulds, she'd contrive for him till her 2 hands were dropped off. So I know she'd do watchdog for me, though asking for bones." Miss Fetley rocked with small laughter. "That day," Mrs. Ashcroft went on, "I stood on me feet nigh all the time, watching the doctor go in and out, for they thought it might be in me ribs too. That made me boil break again, issuing a weeping. But it turned out 'twasn't ribs at all, and Harry had a good night. When I heard that next morning, I says to myself, I won't lay and two together yet. I'll keep me leg down a week, and see what comes of it. It didn't hurt me that day to speak of. Seemed more to draw the strength out of me like, and Harry had another good night. That made me persevere. But I didn't dare lay 2 and 2 together till the weekend, and then Harry came forth even and almost himself again. Nothing hurt outside nor in of him. I nigh fell on my knees in the wash-house when Bessie was up street. I got you now, my man, I says. You'll take your good from me, thout knowing it till my life's end. Oh, God, send me long to live for Harry's sake, I says. And I don't know, that didn't steal me ragens." "For good?" Miss Fetley asked. "They come back, plenty times. But, let me be how 'twould, I knowed I was doing it for him. I knowed it. I took and worked me pains on and off, like regulating my own rage, till I learned to have 'em at my commandments. And that was funny, too. There was times, Liz, when my trouble would shrink and dry up like. First, I used to try and fetch it on again, being fearful to leave Harry alone too long for anything to lay hold of. Presently, I come to see that it was a sign he'd do all right a while, and so I saved myself." "How long for?" Mrs. Fetley asked with deepest interest. "I've gone the better part of a year once or twice, and nothing more to show than a little weeping core of it like, all shrinked up and dried off. Then he'd inflame up for a warning, and I'd suffer it. When I couldn't do no more, and I had to keep going on with my London work, I lay me leg high on a chair till it eased. Not too quick. I knowed by the feel of it at those times that Harry was in need. Then I'd send another 5 shillings to Bess, or something for the children, to find me out if, maybe, he'd have took any hurt through my neglects. 'Twas so. Years in, years out, I worked it that way, Liz, and he got his good from me without knowing, for years and years." "But what did you get out of it, Graw?" Miss Fetley almost wailed. "Did you see I'm regular? Times when I was here in my old days ain't more than that now I'm here for good. But he's never looked at me, nor any other woman except his mother. Oh, I used to watch and listen, so did she." "Years and years," Miss Fetley repeated. "And where's he working now?" "Oh, he's given up catering quite a while. He's worked for one of them big tractorising firms, ploughing sometimes, and sometimes off with lorries, far as Wales, I've heard. He come out to his mother 'tween whiles, but I don't set eyes on him now, for weeks on end. No odds. His job keeps him from continuing in one stay anywheres." "But just for the sake of saying something, suppose Harry did get married," says Miss Fetley. Mrs. Ashcroft drew her breath sharply between her still even and natural teeth. "That ain't been required of me," she said. "I reckon my pains will be counted agin that, don't you, Liz? It ought to be, dearie, it ought to be. It do hurt sometimes. You shall see it when the nurse comes. Since she don't know it's turned." Mrs. Fetley understood. Human nature seldom walks up to the word cancer. "Be certain you're sure, Gra?" she asked. "I was sure of it when old Mr. Mossel had me up on his study and spoke a long piece about my faithful service. I've obliged 'em and all for a goodish time, but not enough for a pension. But they give me a weekly allowance for life. I knew what that signified, as long as 3 years ago. That don't prove it, Gra. To give 15 bob a week to a woman who'd lived 20 years in the course of nature, it do." "You're mistook, Miss Fetley insisted. "Liz, there's no mistaking when the edges are all healed up like, same as the collar. You'll see it, and I laid out Dora Wickwood, too. She had it under the armpit like." Miss Fetley considered a while, and bowed her head in finality. "How long you reckon 'twill allow you?" Counting for now, dearie. Slow come, slow go. But if I don't set eyes on you for next helping, this'll be goodbye, Liz. Don't know as I'll be able to manage by then. Not thought of having a little dog to lead me. For the children, they won't be a trouble. And oh, Gra, I'm binding up. Oh, that was why you want more than fingering with your quilt patches all the while. I was wondering, but the pain do count, don't you think, Liz? The pain do count in Harry, where I want him. Say it can't be wasted like. I'm sure of it, dearie. You'll have your reward. I don't want no more of this, if the pain is taken into the reckoning. 'Twill be, Gra. There was a knock on the door. That's nurse. She's before her time, said Mrs. Ashcroft. Open to her. The young lady entered briskly, all the bottles in her bag clicking. Evening, Mrs. Ashcroft, she began. I've come round a little earlier than usual because of the Institute dance tonight. You won't be mad, will you? Oh, no. Me dancing days are over. Mrs. Ashcroft was a self-contained domestic at once. My old friend Mrs. Fetley here has been setting and talking with me for a while. I hope she hasn't been fatiguing you, said the nurse a little frostily. Quite the contrary. It has been a pleasure. Only just at the end I felt a bit flogged out like. Yes. The nurse was on her knees already, with the washes to hand. When old ladies get together they talk a deal too much, I've noticed. Maybe we do, says Mrs. Fetley, rising. So now I'll make myself scarce. Look at it first, though, said Mrs. Ashcroft feebly. I'd like you to look at it. Mrs. Fetley looked and shivered. Then she leaned over and kissed Mrs. Ashcroft once on the waxy yellow forehead, and again on the faded gray eyes. Do it count, don't it, the pain? The lips that still kept trace of their original molding hardly more than breathed the words. Mrs. Fetley kissed them and moved toward the door.